When an officer asks, "Do you have any weapons?" it can sound casual, almost routine, like small talk at the start of a conversation. But it's not casual at all. That question is one of the most deliberate moments in any police encounter, and understanding why it's asked changes everything about how you experience that moment. From the officer's perspective, the first priority is safety. They don't know who you are yet, they don't know your intentions, and they're trained to control uncertainty as fast as possible. That single question is designed to reduce unknowns, to size up the situation, and to decide what happens next in the encounter. Now, here's what most people don't realize. That question isn't just about weapons in the obvious sense. It's not only about guns or knives, it's also about gathering information, setting the tone, and sometimes opening the door to further questioning or action. Officers are trained to ask it early because the answer can influence how the stop unfolds, how close they stand, whether backup is requested, and whether a search becomes part of the conversation. So when people treat it like a throwaway question and respond emotionally or nervously, they're already giving up control of the interaction. Another important thing to understand is that this question often serves a legal purpose beyond safety. Your response can become part of the official record. It can be written into a report, repeated in court, or used to justify what happened next. Even a poorly worded but honest answer can later be interpreted in a way you never intended. That's not because you did something wrong, but because words spoken under pressure don't always come out clean, precise, or legally helpful. Many people assume that if they have nothing to hide, they should just explain everything. They think more talking equals more cooperation. But in reality, the law doesn't reward extra explanations. It rewards clarity and restraint. When someone starts adding details, qualifying statements, or nervous jokes, they may unknowingly create ambiguity. Ambiguity invites follow-up questions. Follow-up questions expand the encounter. And once the encounter expands, you're no longer just answering a simple safety question. You're participating in an investigation. It's also important to recognize that officers are trained to read behavior as much as words. Hesitation, over-explaining, shifting tone, or changing your story can all be interpreted as uncertainty or deception, even when none exists. That's why the question is powerful. It tests not only what you say, but how you say it. The more complicated your answer, the more room there is for misunderstanding. This is where people get tripped up. They hear the question and their brain races. Should I explain? Should I justify? Should I mention this one thing just in case? That mental scramble often leads to responses that are longer than necessary and less protective than intended. And once words are spoken, they can't be taken back. Silence after the fact doesn't erase what was already said. There's also a psychological element at play. The question puts people in a defensive mindset. It subtly shifts the balance of power by prompting a response that feels mandatory, even when it may not be. Many people answer not because they've thought it through, but because they feel pressure to comply instantly. That pressure is exactly why preparation matters. Knowing why the question is asked ahead of time keeps you from being caught off guard. And let's be clear about something important. Understanding this dynamic is not about being anti-police or confrontational. It's about being aware. Officers are doing their job as trained. Citizens should do the same by knowing their rights and responding in a way that is calm, lawful, and measured. Respect and self-protection are not opposites. They can exist together, and when they do, encounters are usually shorter, smoother, and safer for everyone involved. When you recognize that this question is a pivot point, everything changes. It's the moment where the encounter can either stay narrow and controlled or widen unnecessarily. It's the moment where careless words can create problems, or careful ones can prevent them. And it's the moment where your composure matters more than your intentions. People often ask later, why did it escalate? Or how did it turn into that? Very often the answer traces back to early questions like this one. Not because the person was guilty, but because they didn't realize how much weight those early answers carried. Preparation replaces panic. Awareness replaces regret. So when that question comes, it shouldn't feel shocking or confusing anymore. It should feel familiar. You should recognize it for what it is, a standard strategic question designed to assess risk and control the situation. And when you understand that, you stop reacting and start responding with intention. Most people believe that if they're innocent, talking openly will clear everything up. It feels logical. If you didn't do anything wrong, why not just explain yourself? The problem is that the legal system doesn't work on feelings or intentions, it works on words. And words, once spoken to law enforcement, don't live in the moment anymore. They live on paper, in reports, in recordings, and sometimes in courtrooms months or even years later, stripped of tone, context, and stress. When you say too much, even with the best intentions, you create opportunities for misunderstanding. Small details can be remembered incorrectly. Phrases can be paraphrased. Nervous qualifiers like I think, maybe, or not really can suddenly sound uncertain when written down. What felt like honesty in the moment can later look like inconsistency, and inconsistency is often treated as suspicion, not humanity. People also underestimate how stress affects speech. During a police encounter, adrenaline is high, your heart rate is up, your brain is moving faster than your mouth. That's not the ideal condition for precise language, yet precision is exactly what the law expects. A harmless attempt to clarify can accidentally broaden the scope of the stop. A casual comment can trigger a follow-up question, and each follow-up question increases the chance of saying something that wasn't necessary or helpful. Another thing people don't realize is that law enforcement is trained to keep conversations going. That's not personal. It's procedural. The more someone talks, the more information becomes available to assess, question, and sometimes challenge. So when you volunteer extra details, you're not shortening the encounter. You're often extending it. You're giving the situation more material than it needs. There's also a common misconception that silence or short answers look suspicious. In reality, the law does not require you to be conversational. It requires you to comply with lawful commands. There's a difference. Being polite and being verbose are not the same thing. One keeps things calm, the other can complicate them. Calm, minimal responses are often the safest and most professional way to handle the moment. Even people who are completely law-abiding can get caught in this trap. They assume that explaining context will help the officer understand them better. But the officer's role in that moment is not to resolve your story. It's to control the scene and gather information. Your explanation may not land the way you hope, and once it's out there, it's no longer yours to shape. Another risk of oversharing is that it can unintentionally waive protections. People don't always realize that volunteering information can open doors that were otherwise closed. An encounter that could have ended quickly becomes longer, more complex, and more invasive, not because of wrongdoing, but because of words offered freely without strategy. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Honesty does not guarantee protection. You can be truthful and still face consequences if your words are interpreted in a way that justifies further action. That's why the advice is never about lying. It's about limiting exposure. Silence and precision are not about hiding, they're about safeguarding. This is why lawyers so often say that talking less is not about being difficult. It's about recognizing that you are not trained for this environment the way officers are. They operate within a system they know inside and out. Most people don't. So the smartest move is not to try to outtalk the situation, but to keep it narrow and controlled. Think about how many times people replay encounters in their head afterward, wishing they hadn't said something, wishing they had kept it simpler. That regret usually doesn't come from what they did, it comes from what they said. And that regret is avoidable with one mindset shift. You don't need to explain yourself in the moment to protect yourself in the long run. When you understand that saying less is often safer than saying more, your approach changes. You stop feeling pressured to fill silence. You stop assuming that cooperation means conversation. And you start recognizing that your rights don't disappear just because a question is asked. There's a reason the idea of a short, precise response matters so much in moments like this. In high-pressure situations, complexity is the enemy. The more words you use, the more chances there are for confusion, misinterpretation, or escalation. That's why a calm, carefully chosen response isn't a boo. Sounding clever, it's about staying protected. Brevity isn't weakness, it's control. When you answer with just a few deliberate words, you're doing several things at once. You're showing that you're composed. You're signaling that you understand the moment. And you're reducing the amount of material that can be questioned, repeated, or reframed later. Short responses create clean edges around the interaction. They keep it from spilling into areas it doesn't need to go. People often worry that a brief answer will sound rude or uncooperative. But tone matters more than length. A steady voice, neutral expression, and respectful delivery communicate cooperation far better than nervous over-explaining ever could. Officers are trained to assess demeanor quickly. Calm confidence tends to de-escalate, while rambling often raises flags, even unintentionally. There's also something powerful about predictability. When your response is clear and concise, it removes guesswork, it doesn't invite. Follow up the way vague or qualified answers do. It doesn't leave space for assumptions. It simply addresses the question and stops there. That's not avoidance, that's precision. Think about how often people answer questions by layering extra information that wasn't requested. They start answering the question they think is coming next instead of the one that was actually asked. In legal situations, that habit can be costly. A precise response keeps you anchored in the present moment and prevents the conversation from drifting into unnecessary territory. Another overlooked factor is memory. Stress affects recall for everyone involved. A short, direct answer is easier to remember accurately. Long explanations are more likely to be summarized or paraphrased later, and summaries rarely capture nuance. Precision protects against distortion. There's also a psychological benefit for you. Knowing ahead of time that you have a prepared, limited response reduces anxiety. You're not scram. Ling to decide what to say. You're not second-guessing yourself mid-sentence. Preparation replaces panic. And when you feel grounded, your body language reflects that calm, which further stabilizes the interaction. This approach doesn't mean you're trying to win the encounter. It means you're trying to keep it from becoming something it doesn't need to be. The goal isn't dominance or defiance, it's containment. A few well-chosen words act like guardrails. They keep the exchange on track and prevent it from veering off into complications. It's also worth understanding that officers encounter all kinds of responses. Emotional responses, argumentative responses, evasive responses, and yes, concise responses. A brief, calm answer doesn't stand out as suspicious on its own. What stands out is inconsistency, agitation, or unnecessary elaboration. Simplicity often blends in, and blending in is not a bad thing during a police encounter. People sometimes think that being assertive means being verbose, but real assertiveness is quiet. It's controlled. It doesn't need to prove itself. A precise response says, "I'm aware, I'm calm, and I'm not giving you more than what's required." That message is delivered not through attitude, but through restraint. And here's the key alignment with everything else being said. This isn't about memorizing a script to sound clever. It's about adopting a mindset where fewer words equal fewer risks, where respect and boundaries exist together, where you understand that the moment doesn't demand a story, it demands composure. Once you internalize that, everything else becomes easier. You stop feeling the urge to fill silence. You stop overthinking how you're being perceived. You focus on staying calm, compliant where required, and quiet where allowed. That's not fear. That's strategy. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have is thinking that protecting your rights automatically puts you at odds with law enforcement. It doesn't. In fact, when handled correctly, the right response can make an encounter smoother for everyone involved. A calm, measured answer doesn't just shield you. It also helps the officer do their job without unnecessary tension or escalation. Officers are trained to prior. It ties safety above all else. They're watching hands, posture, tone, and movement long before they analyze words. When your response is short, steady, and respectful, it sends a powerful signal that you're not a threat and not unpredictable. That matters more than most people realize. Predictability lowers stress on both sides, and lower stress leads to better outcomes. Escalation often doesn't come from defiance, it comes from uncertainty. When an officer can't tell what someone is thinking or where a conversation is headed, caution increases. More caution can mean more control measures, more questioning, and sometimes more intrusion. A clean, neutral response reduces that uncertainty. It says this situation doesn't need to be bigger than it already is. At the same time, a precise response protects your boundaries. It allows you to acknowledge the question without opening doors you didn't intend to open. That balance is key. You're not ignoring the officer. You're not challenging authority. You're simply answering in a way that keeps the encounter focused and contained. There's also a misconception that officers expect long explanations. Most don't. They expect clarity. They're trained to work with limited information quickly. When you offer a short response delivered calmly, it fits the structure they operate within. It doesn't disrupt the flow of the stop, it supports it. This approach also helps avoid emotional misreads. When people get nervous, they often sound defensive even when they're not. That defensiveness can be mistaken for resistance or concealment. A composed response minimizes that risk. It keeps emotion out of the exchange and keeps the focus on procedure. Another important aspect is respect. Respect isn't about surrendering rights, it's about how you carry yourself. Saying less while remaining polite shows maturity and awareness. It tells the officer you understand the seriousness of the moment without turning it into a confrontation. Mutual respect often sets the tone for everything that follows. And let's be honest, most people want the encounter to end as quickly as possible. The fastest path to that outcome is rarely arguing or oversharing. It's staying calm, complying with lawful instructions, and not creating additional issues that need to be resolved. A short, appropriate response does exactly that. This is why the idea that asserting rights causes problems is so misleading. Problems usually arise when situations become emotionally charged or unnecessarily complicated. Clear boundaries and calm delivery reduce both. When done correctly, asserting rights quietly can actually de-escalate a situation rather than inflame it. It's also worth noting that officers are human. They respond to tone and demeanor just like anyone else. When you're respectful and composed, it often brings the temperature of the interaction down. That doesn't mean you're relying on goodwill. It means you're not adding friction where no knee is needed. Everything about this approach aligns with safety, legality, and practicality. It doesn't assume bad intent. It doesn't invite conflict. It simply keeps the encounter within reasonable limits. That's good for you, and it's good for the officer standing in front of you. After you give that response, the moment doesn't end, but the most important part has already passed. What happens next is where discipline matters. This is where people either stay protected or slowly undo everything they did right just seconds earlier. The key is understanding that you don't need to do anything dramatic. You need to maintain the same calm, controlled approach and let the situation unfold without volunteering more than what's required. Once you've answered, silence becomes your ally. Silence is not disrespect. Silence is not resistance. Silence is simply the absence of unnecessary words. Many people feel uncomfortable with quiet and instinctively try to fill it, especially under stress. That urge is natural, and it's also risky. Every additional sentence creates new opportunities for confusion, follow-up questions, or misinterpretation. Staying quiet keeps the encounter narrow and predictable. At the same time, silence does not mean ignoring lawful instructions. If an officer gives a clear, lawful command, you comply calmly and without commentary. You don't narrate your actions. You don't explain why you're doing them. You simply do what's required and return to stillness. That balance, quiet but compliant, is one of the most effective ways to keep things from escalating. Another critical piece is body language. Words may stop, but communication doesn't. Slow movements, visible hands, steady posture, and relaxed breathing all reinforce the message that you're not a threat and not unpredictable. These signals matter. They often speak louder than anything you could say. When your body language matches your calm response, it strengthens the sense that the situation is under control. This is also the point where patience becomes essential. People sometimes feel that if they just explain a little more, the officer will understand and the stop will end faster. In reality, explanations often slow things down. They introduce new information that has to be processed, checked, or questioned. Patience keeps the timeline short. Let the officer finish what they need to do without adding complications. If there comes a moment where questioning continues beyond what's necessary, this is where clarity matters. You don't argue. You don't lecture. You don't get emotion. Calmly asserting boundaries when appropriate keeps the interaction from drifting. The goal is never to challenge, it's to maintain focus. Calm focus shortens encounters. Emotional reactions lengthen them. Another important mindset shift is letting go of the need to win. The interaction. This isn't a debate. It's not a performance. It's a temporary situation that will end. The safest outcome isn't proving a point. It's walking away without consequences. That perspective makes it easier to stay quiet, composed, and patient. People often replay these moments afterward and realize the turning point wasn't a command or a search. It was a sentence they didn't need to say. Avoiding that regret comes from understanding that the work is mostly done once you've answered appropriately. After that, restraint does the heavy lifting. It's also worth remembering that you're not required to manage the officer's comfort with conversation. You don't need to entertain, you don't need to reassure verbally. Professional silence paired with respectful compliance is enough. It's effective precisely because it doesn't create friction. And when the encounter finally ends, that's it. No final explanations, no parting commentary, just leave calmly and carry on. The goal from the beginning was always the same: minimize risk, protect yourself, and keep the situation from becoming more than it needs to be.